Welcome to Passport to Wealth. I'm your host, Arielle Tucker, certified financial planner and fellow U.S. expat. On this show, we bring together cross-border experts and global Americans to help you make confident decisions about your life, your money, and your next move abroad. Let's get started. Welcome back to Passport to Wealth. My name is Arielle Tucker. I'm a IRS enrolled agent and certified financial planner. And today I am joined with Carlos Lorenzo, a Spain-based immigration and tax lawyer and the founder of American&Legal Spain, a firm dedicated to helping Americans legally move, live, and thrive in Spain. Carlos specializes in Spanish immigration, residency law, and taxation, guiding U.S. citizens through pre-tax planning, visa options, residence permits, and long-term relocation planning. Through his work at American&Legal Spain, he supports individuals, families, retirees, and digital nomads navigating the legal complexities of moving to Spain, from initial visa applications to permanent residency. With a deep expertise in Spanish immigration law and tax, and a strong focus on serving the American expat community, Carlos has become a trusted resource for those looking to make a move to Spain with clarity and confidence. Carlos, thank you so much for joining me on Passport to Wealth.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Arielle. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I found your story so interesting because you're Spanish, but you actually spent part of your career living in the U.S. and studying in the U.S. And so you've kind of developed this expertise in serving U.S. expats. So I wanted to just invite you to expand on your background a little bit and what led you to establishing your firm and your work today.
Well, thank you so much, Arielle. When I started studying, I did like law, international relations, and then I started working in corporate law, doing like projects that were like based in the United States, but from Spain. At some point, I realized I actually want to enjoy the American culture. And then I moved to Arkansas to work for the summer. It was an interesting experience because if you say Arkansas to an American, it's going to be like, wait, that's not the typical destination for a European
That's not
person.
Hollywood, America.
Yeah, definitely. Not at all. Not at all. And that's true. But I was able to enjoy a bit more the American culture, the true and all American culture. Then after that, I came back to Spain. I started working again in Spain and law firm. And I realized I actually want to go back to the US, but to develop more my legal career. And then I moved to Portland, Oregon. That is also not the typical destination for Spanish or like even European citizens. And I started working in a law firm. It was a law firm that was based on litigation with the Social Security. So I was just basically dealing with, all kind of people that were having like a better situation with the Social Security system, a worse situation. And I was able to basically travel with all types of Americans from a federal point of view of, all parts of the United States, because Social Security law in the United States is federal. And then I was basically bringing that practice there. At some point, I had to come back to Spain for like immigration purposes. And then I realized Spain needs more of the Americans. The Americans are basically, dealing with other countries of the European Union, but we need more Americans in Spain. We have a pretty similar culture. We have a pretty similar lifestyle. We're really close when it comes to, mentality, attitude, like things to cover. And then I opened this project and I'm basically, just working with Americans that are planning or, in the process of moving to Spain. And when they're here in Spain, we cover, the legal and tax support for them.
I have to say, it is just so nice to hear someone say Spain or Europe needs some more Americans because I feel like we're in such a weird time right now where it just seems like all the borders are closing and everything's getting so strict and difficult. And it's just so nice to hear like that welcoming tone, right? That Spanish culture. So thank you for saying that. And I appreciate that.
And it is a fact. At the end of the day, Americans, even if you don't want to believe it, you have a lot of common with the Spanish culture. You're used to countries of Latin America, being a lot in the United States. The United States was built immigration. And at the end of the day, it's easier for an American, and you might disagree with this, to move to Spain because they're used to the Spanish language and to the culture than maybe to Germany or maybe to Switzerland. Because the culture of the Americans is really warm, really welcoming. And that's much more the Spanish culture than any other culture in Europe. In fact, me as an Spanish, I might feel more comfy with an American than with other culture of Europe at some point, right? So, and saying any culture is different than other. Like at the end of the day, all the European culture has something in particular, but the American and the Spanish, they match pretty well.
Mm-hmm. And I always tell people that as they're exploring different countries, because sometimes I have calls from people and they're like, I want to move to Europe. And I'm like, wow, that's a big place. Let's think about what countries would be a good fit. And I always think about personality fit. And I've said this before on the podcast, I've lived in Germany and Switzerland. That fits my personality really well. And I get kind of nervous once I start getting close to the Italian border and I just feel like things are falling apart and it's too relaxed and I can't handle it. So It's really important to understand what fits your personality. And, if you're used to a Spanish culture and that friendly culture, like I get nervous when people are too friendly. I do. I really do. So
Yeah. And that's interesting about Spain, because if you go, for example, to the south of Spain, where I'm from, people are like really friendly. But if you go to the north, they're gonna be like a bit more cold, right? So at the end of the day, you just gotta see Spain as an entity. Like, okay, Spain.
Mhm.
I like the culture, I like the vibes, I like the food, I like, the system. But where inside of Spain I want to live? I want to live in the north, that is going to be less sunny and more cold, and the people are going to be a bit more distant. I want to be in the south, that the people are going to be super warm, and I'm going to have like 300 days of sun per year. Like, you choose the lifestyle that you want, and most of the visas, when you're moving to Spain, we'll talk about that, allow you to be traveling around the country, right? Also, this is really important. It has like tax implications, the part that you live in Spain. It's kind of the same that in the United States, not the same living in California than living in Wyoming or New Mexico or in Nevada. And it happens the same in Spain. Some parts have wealth tax, some parts have 100% rebate on the wealth tax. So it's also a thing to consider when you're like a high net worth individual and you're planning to move to Spain.
Wow. So I didn't realize that each state has just like how the US states, right? We have 50 different state laws overlaid on the federal law. That's how our system works. Not all states have state tax. I think 7 US states don't have state tax. But in that same vein, Spain has a similar system.
It has like a similar system. It's not on the same level of the United States, because I would say in the United States, the states has like a bit more of ability to actually develop their own laws and establish, their own tax system. In Spain, the federal system, is like the main one, but also they have like different laws that you can change according to the people that are immigrating to your part. Let's say, for example, Madrid and Andalusia, they have like 100% rebate on the wealth tax. So that means on practice, you only have like some kind of liability considering that if you have like more than 3 millions. Well, if you move to Valencia, Barcelona is, Catalonia in general is really, really bad for taxes. But if you're having more than 500K, you might have some kind of liability, right? If if you have like a family member and the family member has assets in the north of Spain, the inheritance tax, the state tax might be, 50% of the assets. While in Madrid,
Wow.
has like a 99% deduction, same in Andalusia, same in Extremadura. It depends a lot. And at some point, the parts of Spain, they want to trap people. And the way to trap people is basically through different incentives, tax incentives, according to the people that they want.
Yeah. So some of these states are looking to really attract those high net worth individuals and bring the money or potentially jobs with them.
Yes, and also it's really interesting because, for example, Extremadura, that is the autonomic community, like the state that is close to Portugal, they're liking a lot of people. So they're offering, for example, an incentive for remote workers that if they're moving there to a town that has like less than 5K, citizens or people living there, they're going to give them like an incentive of 15K per year. And
Whoa,
also
whoa,
a
whoa.
40% deduction on their personal income. So at the end,
Wow.
every part of Spain has the ability to basically play with that. And if you move to the Canary Islands, you have like a deduction on trips to Spain of 75%. Spain is like you got to find the tax loopholes there. If you move
Okay.
to Ceuta, is in Africa, you have like a 40% deduction on the personal income. You got to find the loopholes. And that's what you need an attorney for. But at the end of the day, I'm not telling someone to go to an area that they might not well live for taxes, but it's a huge incentive at the end of the day.
No, and I think we always say that, right? Don't let your life should not be led with tax planning,
Yeah.
because especially if you're a US expat, you're still tied back to the US system. So you're always going to pay the higher of Spanish tax rates or US tax rates. So if you get your
Uh-huh.
Spanish tax rate down to 0, it doesn't really matter because we still have to pay the US tax rate. So you can kind of optimize a little bit just by the fact that US citizens were stuck with the US system. But talk me through like an initial conversation. I call you and I say, okay, I want to move to Spain. And you say, where, right? How do you start that conversation with your clients?
What I say to my clients, and this is a tip that we'll talk later, but what I always say to my clients is the first thing before figuring out where to live, how to structure your business, your tax planning, is what visa am I going to apply for? It's just a visa that I need to apply at the consulate for 1 year. Am I going to be working on that visa? Is my family allowed to come with me? Because the borders in Europe, they're getting really tight, right? Like the visas are getting more restricted, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, you had like a lot of options to, bring your family with you with any kind of visa, maybe study for 1 year, for 2 years, bring your family, change the status later. But in May of 2025, they changed the law. They changed it in November 2024, but in May 2025, was put in place the new immigration law of the Spain, and the options to bring your family, they're getting tighter because they realize, okay, a lot of people are moving to Spain, for example, on a student visa, but they're bringing their family with them. So it's just like a path to actually enter another type of visa. So they're cutting that option away. So the first thing to do is you figure out what visa I'm going. Okay, is that a visa that is linking me to a certain school out of Spain? Then I might just, maybe I'm just gonna be able to be in Madrid. Maybe I'm gonna be able to be in Valencia or in Barcelona, like in the big cities.
So it's tied to like a location then. It's not just...
It depends on the visa.
Okay.
For example, some student visas, you're gonna go to study Spanish and it has to be affiliated with the university. But for example, a university that is in a random city of Spain doesn't have that. Like they're on like on the big cities like Madrid, Barcelona. So then depending on the visa that you choose, you're going to have to choose, how you do it. Then I'll look at the visa, for example, if a person is, a retiree and has like not a lot of passive income, they got to think that at the end, the next year, they're going to ask, in some parts, they're going to ask for just 1 year of funds, while in other parts for 2 years of funds. So that's also considering, the long-term relocation. And that's also another thing that I say to my clients, like, how do you see yourself living in Spain? Do you see yourself for just 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, permanent residency, citizenship after 10 years? Because depending on that goal, the relocation is going to change a lot from an immigration point of view, from a tax planning point of view, and from a relocation point of view. So it's really tricky to plan something for Americans because also Americans, they don't really feel at home until they have either permanent residency or ideally citizenship, right? It's really tricky. And that's why we like to take the time with them and, advise on them on what parts of Spain are ready for them, what parts of Spain will suit more their lifestyle. They're moving from California. Maybe the north is not the place for them because it's always cloudy and rainy. They're moving from, the north. Maybe it's not the south is not the better area for them. So it's really tricky. And we like to spend the time with the clients, make them understand, the decisions that they're taking from an immigration point of view, what they're going to have to structure from a tax planning point of view. A lot of structure that work in the US, like an S Corp, for example, doesn't work really well in Spain. So you got to structure all that. You got to get out of your mindset.
Just to pause everyone, because so an S Corp is like a type of election for a company, right?
Yes.
And so in that same vein, LLCs in the US, a lot of we all in the US, we love our LLCs.
An American, is born with an LLC. Yeah.
Are they recognized in Spain?
They are not recognized to the full extent that they are in the US. They are recognized as pass-through. So at the end of the day, they don't solve the issue that Spain has, or even federal law has in the United States. That is, when you're making a lot of money, when you're like high earner, you're going to the highest part of the bracket. It's progressive. So it doesn't solve the issue that is separating the business profits from the personal profits, because it's at the end a pass-through, right? It doesn't matter if it's like an S corporation that you're able to put yourself a salary, don't pay self-employment taxes, and then report K1 income that is, like do like a distribution of profits, but it's taxes and investment income. Spain doesn't care at the end of the day. If you have the control of the business, they're going to attribute everything to you as economics means, and then you're getting up to 47% of taxes. And that's what we're trying to avoid within our time, to structure something that works in the US and works in Spain, depending,
I'm going to play devil's advocate because this is the question I get all the time.
Yeah.
And I want you to answer it. Well, no, but my LLC is US based. I'm the sole owner of the LLC, but all of the income is coming from the US. So therefore, I don't have to report it in Spain, right?
You do have to report it in Spain. Yes, because Spain tax you based on the days that you spend in the country, or based on the fact that your spouse or kids are in the country, or if you have like some kind of economic miss in the country. When you're moving to Spain on a visa, the assumption that Spain is going to make at the end of the day is that you're going to pay taxes in Spain. If the taxes in the US are structured in a way, your business is structured in a way that you're getting all, in a pass-through way, like in your 1040, in April, from January to April, you need to report that income in your personal level, like the income doesn't stay in the business. General rule is that you need to report that in Spain. You'll be able to use the tax-free conventions, the FOIA in the United States, the FTC, so you're not going to be leading to double taxation. But it doesn't it doesn't solve the issue that the taxes are going to be high, right? So that's what you got to structure with time. With enough time. Once you figure out the visa, you move to the tax planning. Okay, what do you have right now? What do you have to play with this? Do you have employees? Do you have a physical office? Do you have just a business? Are you working remote? Are you working sometime in person? So Every case is different, and every business in the United States is different. And the loopholes that you can find in the United States, like employing, your children and stuff like that, they are not available in Spain. Literally, if you employ your children in Spain, he's gonna have to do like a tax return just to show that. So it's like, get out of the American mindset that they're benefiting you for planning more. In Spain, they're gonna treat you like an enemy. They want you to pay taxes. You don't have access to all the expenses that you have in the United States. At the end of the day, you gotta put your mindset of like, I'm moving to Europe, I'm moving to Spain. I'm gonna keep working in the US, my income is in the US, but Spain is gonna want that. That's the main reason why I'm here, to support this country and to support the system, to support, the social security, the tax agency, the taxes. And that's why you gotta figure it out in a way that you keep contributing to the system, you keep supporting, what they're giving you, free healthcare, free education, all the things that you're getting in exchange, but also not to a point that gets crazy for your tax position.
Yeah, 47% when most Americans, and also in Spain, there's a progressive system, but those progressive tiers are really collapsed. So
Yeah, that's the difference.
when do you hit the 47% tax rate? Like, what's the range of
Normally,
income?
when you're making more than 65K. Yeah. So I would say the biggest issue is when you're,
65,000 euros.
yes, when you're making more
Okay.
than 100K, once you're getting to a point that the effective tax rate is really tricky. It's not like in the United States that even if you make like a lot of money, the how the brackets change is like less intense than in Spain. In Spain, since we are in a social system at the end of the day, like they assume that if you're making more, that money should go to the taxes at some point, right? So the trickiest point, if you're making more than 100K, I mean, I would say a lot of clients coming from the US system, they are 100K euros, like 100,000 euros. Um, that's when it's going to get trickier because at some point, the effective tax rate is going to be like 40 something percent, 40%, 50%, depending on how much are you making. So that's what you got to structure ideally as soon as possible as you move or you plan to move to Spain, considering as well how long are you moving. Because maybe it doesn't make sense to restructure your whole business just for 1 year, and it makes more sense to just count the days that you spend in the country to avoid being a tax resident, right? So every case is different, and that's why I always recommend Americans to actually spend the time and the money on planning this with time. Don't go with just the first immigration attorney that they say that is like, oh, we'll help you move to Spain. Because the biggest issue is not the visa. The visa can be, you can be super creative, you can figure it out. The issue is when you're in Spain, you put your foot in Spain, and Spain is like, okay, this is for us. What are we going to do here? The tax agency says you, says your business. Are like, okay, this is what got. So you got to organize that literally the second after you organize your visa pipe.
Yeah. I find this across European countries, once you're on the radar as a tax resident in that country, they will become very aggressive, especially if they realize you're a high income earner or you have high assets. They'll become much more aggressive about keeping you, knowing, getting a lot of information from you, understanding how your business is structured, how many days are you, where are you, what are you doing? I mean, you're going to get a lot more questions. People in the US are used to the IRS system, which is like basically like if you're, part of the unlucky 0.1% that gets audited, then you have to provide all this information. But in Europe, more generally, they'll look at you closer. So you just have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and if I would say the biggest difference, for example, with the LLCs, the expenses that you can cover with the LLC, I mean, it's really, really hard to get audited by the IRS. Here in Spain, if for whatever reason you rent a car, they're going to audit you because you're like, oh, you're working remote. What do you need a car for? I'm visiting clients. I don't believe it. You got to show it that you actually went to a lunch with a client. Show me that the invoice has your identification number, your taxpayer number. And it's like you're getting on a constant pressure of like, okay, I think this expense is good for my business, but I'm not able to prove it. So it's really totally changed the mindset, right? And I'm not saying Spain is really bad on this because, I would say all the European countries are really tricky with this. We had clients that, for example, are living in Europe. A client was living in Sweden. She was paying a 64% effective tax rate. And then she's moved to Spain and she's going to be paid like a 20, 25, 30%, structuring a business in the US, structuring a business here. So at the end, you have a lot of things to play with. You just need to do it right. And especially if you're considering long-term life here, to do it in a way that the tax agency finds friendly. And at the end, keep paying taxes. We're not talking about evading taxes or anything. We're talking about making your situation more friendly for your relocation.
Yeah. And I always tell people that, like, this is not tax avoidance, but we are just playing by the rules. And a lot of the rules require you to have pre-planning. You can't just show up, establish residency, and then say, okay, now I want to plan everything. This is all
Yeah.
about proactive pre-planning before you've
Mm.
established residence.
Yeah.
The
And a continuity at the end of the day. Like if you're saying, okay, I'm moving to Spain in 2027, if they audit you, you're gonna be able to show this business structure was in place before moving to Spain. Like it wasn't just created to move to Spain. And that collapsed a lot with the US system because a lot of the times the structure that you make, it doesn't make sense for the US. So it's really tricky at the end of the day, but you can find a way.
we're talking a lot about like business structures, but what about people who are moving and their employer is like, you know what, you're a W-2 employee, work anywhere you want in the world, just, just make sure you do your hours. What are the considerations for these type of people? What do they need special visa? Is this considered like the digital nomad visa? What do they need to be considering?
That's a really tricky issue here, a really tricky topic here. Because let's divide it, okay? Let's put the immigration part first. In the immigration part, the ideal visa for them would be like a digital nomad visa. Let's assume that the company doesn't have like an entity, like a branch in Spain, doesn't have like operations in Spain. They don't have like a branch that they can actually transfer the employee. Let's assume digital nomad visa. You're working for a company located outside of Spain. We have seen different issues in the practice. The first one is the digital nomad still applies as a W-2, right? But what you used to get that is a certificate of coverage from the Social Security of the United States. And that Social Security agreement between the United States and Spain is dated from, 1988. So not a lot of remote workers were in that time. So they only covered like companies that were sending employees for operations overseas. Right now, they start denying them. Right now, they're getting them, but the company is to do a letter saying, okay, I'm sending this employee to Spain for strategic reasons to keep paying the Social Security system of the United States, but not in the Spanish system. What's the issue with this? That at the end, you're giving a letter from your employer to the Social Security, to the tax agency, to the immigration office saying, and sending for an strategic reason an employee to Spain. And that can be used later against you to say, okay, you actually sent an strategic person of your business to Spain. You're gonna establish a business here, an entity here, because you have a person doing operations here and working under the Social Security system here. And they assume if you're performing physically the work here in Spain, you gotta be in the Social Security system here. You're not just for an overseas operation. You're living here. You're in a digital visa here. You're aiming for permanent residency, for citizenship. You gotta be here in the system. And that's the biggest issue. From an immigration point of view, it gives like a lot of issues. From a tax planning point of view, for the entity itself, gives like a lot of issues. And even for the worker, because at the end, with a W-2, you don't really control how you receive the income at your personal level. It's not like if you have an LLC that you can cover expenses. It's not like if you have like some kind of corporation that you can divide between the business profits and the personal profits. W-2, that's it. You hit the income all the year. And it's also even worse. Because let's say a lot of people, for example, they max out their 401ks to get like, to lower the taxable income. That is not respected by Spain. So we're not matching the income in Spain, what you got to report and what you got to report in the United States. And we're not solving the issue that you got to pay a lot of taxes because still the income that you're reporting is pretty high.
Okay. So as an American, we can just show up in Spain and we can be there for 90 days. So if you are just a W-2 employee and you just say, you know what, I'm just going to go work from my hotel room for 90 days, you don't have to register with immigration. You
don't have to register. It is true that it is really hard. I mean, it's really hard for them to track it. It's really hard for them to track it. They don't have the means, but it's different when you do an immigration process and you enter in the system. They have
so
their
it's more like if you want to be in Spain for a year or over 90 days, then you need to start be thinking, how am I going to be here?
As soon as you enter in the system, they're going to track it. And they're putting a lot of tracks to this, even in other visas. For example, student visas, you're allowed to, in fact, we did this with a lot of clients. Like maybe they didn't qualify for the digital nomad for income reasons this moment, but we're like, we want to go to Spain. Then we organize like a student visa. And then the next year we do like a chain of status to a digital nomad visa. And that's allowed because you were not allowed to work for a Spanish company to take away like a job from a Spanish citizen or European citizen, but you were allowed to work for companies outside of the European Union of Spain. And they're putting like a cap on that. They're saying if you're living in Spain, you gotta be registered with the Spanish Social Security system and have like a work authorization to work physically in Spain. So it doesn't work if you're working for a company outside because you're working physically from here. You should be in the system here. So we're seeing that a lot of countries, and this happens, for a while ago in France, it happens, in other countries, they're putting like a lot of cap to like, okay, remote workers that work physically here in Spain. And this applies to other things. For example, France and a lot of countries of the European Union has like limitations with regulated professions, like lawyers, doctors. Spain was allowing them to come to Spain and work remote, saying we're not going to practice in Spain. But they're cutting that. They're saying, okay, you cannot come here to Spain to work remote unless you do like unless you recognize your title in Spain. And that takes, up to 16, 18 months. So we're trying to be super creative with the applications right now. Instead of saying psychologist, we say life consultant. Instead of saying doctor, we say, medical consultant. And they're buying that. But that doesn't happen in a lot of countries. So that's the thing. Like, you gotta see your case one by one and be like, okay, these are the red flags. This is what you're gonna figure it out. This is what you gotta structure. So, and that's the thing. Like, you gotta plan everything pretty well because you gotta cover a lot of things.
Yeah. And I think, like, I'm glad we're having this conversation because before we hit record, we were talking a little bit about like the changes in Portugal. And what I'm telling people, I mean, we've been feeling like this tightening of this immigration across Europe, for the last 10 years. And I'm telling people, if you're interested in going, start doing your exploration trips, start figuring out where you want to go, start having conversations, and just think about where could I potentially want to go. If this is on your bucket list, make it a priority and start making plans to make it happen, because the rules are changing, and kind of like what I say, the deals, like the tax, especially the tax deals, aren't as good as they used to be, And actually, I know we're just about over time, but I'm wondering if you could touch very briefly on the Beckham ruling, because that comes up all the
Beckham
time.
Law.
And I think yeah.
It sounds amazing to just pay 24% of your Spanish source of income to a tax agency like the Spanish one. But at the end of the day, when they issued the Beckham Law, the equivalent in Portugal, it was just to attract talent here. But when they issued that in Spain, it was just to collect more taxes, right? So a lot of people were under wrong impressions. For example, if you're a W-2 and you move to Spain, you can cover that. That's wrong, because you got to be paying the system of Spain. That only applies to Spanish source of income. If you're getting a U.S. source of income as a W-2, doesn't apply. If you're self-employed but you're like a W-2 of your own business, that applies. That's wrong, because at some point the tax agency is going to ask you to show who's the owner of the business. And if you have more than 25%, you're self-employed under the tax system rules of Spain. So at the end of the day, Beckham Law is amazing, but it's what we say to all my clients. You have better options, just structure your business. And if you want to apply for the Beckham Law, the only cases that they qualify 100% right now are the cases that have, linked to a highly skilled worker visa, that the reason to move to Spain is to work for a Spanish company. Not a US company, not your own company, not a company that registered after that. It is really tricky to get it. They're going to audit you 100%. So make sure that you actually know what you're doing, or hire professionals to do it. Not even that. Let's say, even if you qualify at some point, and this is really interesting, if they see, for example, in your Instagram, you're like, buying like a nice house, like buying like a nice car, they're going to audit you anyway, because they're like, we don't have nothing to lose, but you might have money that you're hiding from them.
Wait, the tax authorities are looking at social media?
Yes, they're looking at social media. If you're applying for the non-lucrative visa, and we didn't really touch that, they're going to look at your LinkedIn to see if you're still working. If you work remote, they're going to audit you based on that.
And just to clarify, non-lucrative means you're not working. You're
not allowed to work in Spain at all. There's some loopholes to work outside the United States. Like, for example, if you're like a pilot, stuff like that, like no physically in Spain, but general rule is right now they're not allowing anything. So if you have like any kind of history working remote, they're going to audit you. If you're young, they're going to audit you. If you're not able to show I'm going to retire 100%, they're going to audit you. So a lot of times it makes sense to structure everything, towards the nomad visa, even if you have to pay a bit more taxes, but you're going to have like an easier immigration process. But I will say to all my clients, future clients or listeners here, Spain is amazing. Spain's want you, but definitely spend time organizing everything, because we're talking about your life here. So yeah, that's definitely the tip that I provide.
Okay, that is, then we'll end there, because I think that's the best tip. And regardless of which country you're looking at, I think that tip applies to all country. Calling your planners ahead of time is very important. If you
1 year
just show
ahead of
up,
time. Yeah.
And then, 1 year ahead of time, if you just show up, a lot of those planning opportunities are closed, and you just have to start with, okay, now what's available now that I'm already a resident? Because your residence generally starts like on the day you land, not the day you like get your visa and decide, okay,
exactly.
now I'm here forever.
They're gonna count that, and literally every country changes. This is more your field, but for example, IRAs are not taxed in the same way in the United States, or in Spain, or in Germany. So literally the way that you're gonna organize everything, the way you're going to organize your retirement plans, your withdrawals, your business, it's going to change a lot depending on the country. So make sure to hire professionals that understand your system, either Germany and Switzerland, either Spain, either Portugal, and make sure to actually spend the time that your life requires to move to a new country.
Carlos, it has been such a pleasure speaking with you today. I learned so much about Spain. So thank you for your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me here.
to link all of your information. And then also I just want to give a quick shout out because we do have a wonderful advisory network, and Carlos is part of the Passport to Wealth advisory network. You can find all of his details there. These are all fiduciary advisors, those who are working in the best interest of their clients. We have vetted them and we've made sure that they provide wonderful service to their clients. And that's really important for me to put my name behind. So I hope you can find him there and let him know if you do contact him that you found him through Passport to Wealth.
Yeah, amazing. It's an amazing referral line. And thank you so much for creating this community. I think it's amazing what you do.
Thank you. The content shared in this podcast is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial, tax, or legal advice. We encourage you to consult with a qualified financial advisor, tax professional, or other licensed expert before making any decisions based on the topics discussed. Everyone's financial situation is unique, and personalized guidance from a trusted professional is the best way to ensure your choices align with your individual goals and circumstances.